I pressed the medical alert button until my thumb went numb, waiting for the familiar reassurance tone that meant help was on the way. Nothing happened. The silence was so complete it felt loud, like the house itself was holding its breath. My lungs were already tightening, each inhale scraped instead of filled. I leaned against the hallway wall, trying to slow the panic, trying to tell myself the pendant would connect any second now. It always did. It had been my safety net since my late 20s, ever since my doctor told me my asthma attacks could turn fast without warning. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Not rushing, measured, calm. Riley, my sister, said, her voice flat. Stop performing. I turned my head just enough to see Tessa standing at the end of the hall, arms crossed, watching me struggle for air, like it was an inconvenience. There was no alarm in her face, no urgency, just irritation. I can't breathe, I managed the words barely forming. She sighed. You always do this when attention is involved. You're not subtle, you know, especially right before the will reading. I tried the button again, harder, still nothing. That was when I heard the front door latch click. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. My vision was narrowing, dark at the edges. But then Tessa shifted her weight, blocking the hallway that led to the living room phone. You're not calling 911 over this, she said. I'm not letting you turn this into a scene. This was my childhood home in Charleston, South Carolina. The place I'd grown up believing was safe, even when it never felt kind. I had arrived only a few hours earlier from Denver, dragging a suitcase behind me and telling myself I was just here to pay my respects to Grandpa and get through the will reading like an adult. I hadn't even unpacked. I slid down the wall, my chest burning now, every breath shallow and sharp. The pendant lay useless against my collarbone, a dead weight instead of a lifeline. My mind kept circling the same impossible question. How could it not be working, Tessa? I whispered. Please? She shook her head. Already done with me. If you pass out, I'll deal with it. But I'm not rewarding this. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed. A voice shouted. I didn't know who finally called for help. I only know the sound of sirens felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else's emergency. The paramedics came in fast, hands on my shoulders, oxygen, a mask pressed to my face. One of them, a tall man with dark hair and steady eyes, spoke to me in a low, controlled voice while his partner worked. I'm Caleb, he said. Stay with me. Air finally started to reach places it hadn't a minute before. The room steadied just enough for me to register Tessa standing off to the side, already explaining, already shaping the story. Stress, grief, overreaction. Caleb didn't argue with her. He didn't look at her at all. Instead, his eyes went to the pendant still hanging from my neck, then to the small base unit on the side table. He frowned slightly, stepped closer, and checked the back of it. Has this been unplugged recently? He asked, more to the room than to me. No one answered. He wrote something down, slow and deliberate, before meeting my eyes again. There was something in his expression then. Not sympathy, not suspicion, but recognition. Like he'd seen this kind of silence before. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, I realized one thing with terrifying clarity. My medical alert hadn't failed. It had been made useless. And the person who knew exactly what that meant had been standing right behind me the whole time. By the time I was brought back from the hospital, it was already dark. The street outside my childhood home was quiet in that particular Charleston way, where even the cicadas seemed to lower their voices at night. My chest still ached with each breath, not sharp anymore, just sore and tender, like a bruise you keep pressing to remind yourself it's there. My mother, Marla, followed me inside without touching me. She hovered instead, hands twisting together, her mouth opening and closing as if she were searching for the right tone rather than the right words. You scared everyone, she finally said. Not you almost died. Not are you okay. Just scared everyone. I couldn't breathe, I replied. I wasn't angry. I was tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones. She nodded quickly, eager to move on. The doctor said stress can do that. I didn't correct her. I had learned a long time ago that correcting my mother only made her retreat further into comfort. If something could be labeled as stress, misunderstanding, or drama, she would cling to that explanation with both hands. Tessa wasn't in the room. I could hear her upstairs drawers opening and closing, footsteps moving with the confidence of someone who had never questioned whether she belonged in any space she entered. When I finally went up to my old bedroom, I stopped in the doorway. It was too neat. The bed was made tighter than I ever made it. My suitcase had been pushed against the wall, zipped all the way shut. The small table where I usually kept my medical supplies had been cleared, wiped down, reorganized. Even the charging cable for my alert base unit had been looped carefully and tucked behind the lamp. Someone had been here. Someone who wasn't me. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the familiarity wash over me, the pale yellow walls, the dresser with a loose handle, the faint smell of cedar from the closet. This room had always been my quiet place, even as a child. The one space where I could shut the door and breathe when the rest of the house felt tilted toward my sister. Tessa had always been the center, louder, prettier, easier, the one neighbors asked about, the one teachers remembered. I was the careful one, the sick one, the one who learned early not to ask for too much. Downstairs, voices drifted up. My mother and Tessa talking in low tones the way they always did when they didn't want me involved. "We can't afford problems right now," Tessa said. "Not with everything up in the air," I know my mother murmured. "Just keep things calm until after the will reading." After. Always after. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, following the old hairline crack I used to trace as a teenager. Grandpa's face floated into my mind the way it often did when I felt small. He had been the only one who noticed when I went quiet, who asked questions and waited for real answers. The reason I had come back at all. My phone buzzed softly beside me. A notification from the medical alert company confirming my account request had been received. Nothing more, just a polite acknowledgement. I turned the pendant over in my hand, feeling its smooth surface, its familiar weight. It had never failed me before, not once. And yet earlier that day, it had been nothing more than plastic and promise. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Families misunderstand each other all the time. Accidents happen. Stress does strange things to people. But as I set the pendant carefully on the nightstand, one thought refused to leave me. This house had taught itself how not to hear me a long time ago. And whatever had happened earlier wasn't just about one bad moment. It felt older than that. Practiced. I turned off the light, listening to the sounds of my sister moving freely through the space that had never truly been mine, and wondered how many times before this I had mistaken silence for safety. The morning after my attack was quiet in the way only weekdays can be. No visitors, no interruptions, just the slow rhythm of a house pretending everything had returned to normal. Sunlight crept through the curtains, landing on the medical alert pendant where I'd left it on the nightstand. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up, half expecting it to betray me again. My phone rang just after 9, an unfamiliar number. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in me said not to. "This is Caleb Rivas," the voice said when I answered. "I'm one of the paramedics from yesterday. I need to finish my report and I had a few follow-up questions." He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't ask if I'd been under stress. Instead, he asked, "Who else has access to your medical alert account?" The question landed heavier than it should have. "I'm not sure," I said carefully. "It was set up years ago. My grandfather helped me arrange it after my first hospitalization. My sister might have been listed as an emergency contact." Caleb paused. I could hear papers shifting on his end. Do you know if anyone else would have reason to adjust the base unit or the pairing on your pendant? I closed my eyes. The image of my bedroom, two neat, two-handled, rose uninvited. I didn't unplug anything, I said. I haven't touched the base unit since I arrived. That's what I needed to confirm, he replied. His tone stayed even professional. When we arrived, the base unit wasn't drawing power. The pendant also wasn't paired. That combination doesn't happen from a simple malfunction. My chest tightened again, though this time it wasn't from asthma. I don't want to jump to conclusions, he added. But those are deliberate steps. Someone would have had to physically interact with the unit. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed, letting his words settle. Deliberate steps. Physical interaction. Not a glitch. Not bad timing. Downstairs, I could hear my mother on the phone, her voice light and reassuring, telling someone that I was resting, that everything was fine now. Fine was the word she always reached for when she wanted something to stop being examined. Tessa's car pulled into the driveway shortly after. I watched from the window as she stepped out, sunglasses on, coffee in hand. Already composed. She didn't look like someone who had spent the previous day watching her sister struggle to breathe. Later that afternoon, I called the medical alert company. I kept my voice calm, steady, the way I had learned to speak to insurance representatives and hospital administrators over the years. I requested a copy of my account activity and device logs. The woman on the line told me it would take a couple of business days to process. That was fine. I wasn't in a hurry anymore. For the first time since I'd arrived, I understood that rushing had never served me well in this family. Before hanging up, I asked one more question. If someone changed my settings, would there be a record? Yes, she said. Every adjustment is time-stamped and tied to a device or login. I ended the call and looked back at the pendant in my hand. It felt different now. Less like a comfort, more like evidence. I wasn't ready to accuse anyone. I wasn't ready to confront Tessa or challenge my mother's version of events. I still wanted to believe there was an explanation that didn't involve intent. But something had shifted. For the first time, the silence in this house didn't feel like confusion. It felt like something waiting to be uncovered. By Thursday afternoon, the house had filled with people who spoke in lowered voices and touched my arm like it might break. The visitation was held at the old funeral home on Meeting Street, the one with narrow hallways and framed photographs that smelled faintly of dust and polish. Everyone kept telling me how good I looked, how relieved they were to see me standing, as if survival had settled the matter. Tessa stayed close to me the entire time. She looped her arm through mine when people approached, smiled warmly, answered questions before I could. She told them I'd had a little scare, that the doctors said it was probably stress. Grief does funny things to the body, she said with a practiced shrug. I stood there and let her talk, nodding when expected, conserving my energy the way I always had. At one point, she leaned in close enough that only I could hear her. Let's not make this harder than it already is, she murmured. People are watching, and we don't need drama before the will reading. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The message was clear enough. Our mother floated nearby, relieved by the performance. She introduced Tessa to distant relatives like a shield, proud of how composed she was being, how well she was holding things together. I wondered if she even noticed that no one asked how I was feeling anymore. Once the crisis passed, I had returned to being background. While Tessa was distracted with a group from church, an older man approached me slowly. He introduced himself as Harold Price, a retired accountant who had known my grandfather for decades. He shook my hand with both of his grip firm and steady. Your grandfather talked about you often, he said, especially these last few months. I thanked him, unsure where the conversation was going. He was worried. Harold continued, lowering his voice. Not about dying, about paperwork. He said he felt rushed, like people were asking him to sign things without explaining them properly. Before I could ask more, Tessa reappeared at my side, her smile fixed. "Harold, thank you so much for coming," she said brightly, already steering him away. "You know how exhausting these events can be." He gave me a final look, sympathetic, apologetic, before letting himself be guided off. That night back at the house, I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of it settling, pipes knocking, floorboards creaking. Tessa's laughter drifting up from the living room as she talked on the phone, her voice light, almost cheerful. I wondered who she was telling the story to, and which parts she was leaving out. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, not the alert company, just a message from a cousin asking if I was doing better now. I typed a polite response and set the phone face down. I checked my email again before turning off the light. Still nothing. Just the quiet assurance that my request was being processed. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table while my mother moved around me making coffee, straightening papers, filling the silence with small tasks. The will reading was scheduled for the following Monday at Evan Lindstrom's office downtown. Everything had a time and a place. Everything was proceeding as planned. "You'll rest this weekend?" my mother said, not looking at me. No more excitement. I watched the steam rise from my mug and thought about the word excitement, about how easily it had replaced words like danger and choice. Everyone around me seemed determined to believe the worst was behind us, that whatever had happened was finished and filed away. But I felt the opposite. It wasn't over. It was just waiting. And the closer we got to the will reading, the heavier the air became, like a storm pressing down before the first crack of thunder. The email arrived late Sunday afternoon, slipping into my inbox so quietly I almost missed it. The subject line was plain and technical, the kind people skim past without a second thought. I sat at the small desk in my bedroom. The door closed. The house humming softly around me as if nothing important were happening at all. I opened the attachment with careful hands. The report was longer than I expected. Pages of timestamps, device IDs, and system notes, written in language meant for audits, not emotions. I read it slowly, line by line, the way my grandfather used to read contracts, never assuming the truth would announce itself. There it was. My medical alert account had been accessed the afternoon I arrived. Settings changed. Notifications rerouted. The base unit switched to test mode. The pendant unpaired. Each action logged with precision. Each change timestamped within the same narrow window. And each one traced back to the same device. Tessa's. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. There was no dramatic language in the report. No accusation. Just facts arranged in neat rows, indifferent to what they meant for the people involved. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not rage, not even shock. It was heavier than that. Final. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't stress or carelessness or a bad judgment call made in grief. It was preparation. Someone had taken the time to disable the one thing that stood between me and a medical emergency, then stood back and watched to see if it worked. Downstairs, I could hear my mother talking on the phone, her voice low and warm. She laughed at something the sound light unburdened. I wondered how many times she laughed like that while telling herself things were fine. I printed the report and folded it carefully, sliding it into the bottom of my bag, beneath a stack of old letters and receipts. I wasn't ready to show it to anyone yet. Not Tessa, not my mother, not even to demand an explanation. That was the moment I understood something about myself that I hadn't fully faced before. I had spent my entire life trying to resolve conflict quietly, privately, without making anyone uncomfortable. I had swallowed truth for the sake of peace so often, it had started to feel like virtue. This time, I chose differently. The will reading was scheduled for Monday morning at Evan Lindstrom's office downtown. Evan had been my grandfather's attorney for years, steady and meticulous, the kind of man who believed documentation mattered more than intention. I called his office and asked if I could stop by briefly before the reading. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. When I hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room one last time. The pendant lay on the nightstand, where I'd left it, silent and harmless now. I picked it up and turned it over, tracing the smooth edge with my thumb. I wasn't going to confront Tessa in the kitchen or expose her in a burst of emotion. I wasn't going to let her know I understood what she'd done. She had built her confidence on my silence, on the assumption that I would always choose to step back. I let her keep that belief, because the truth didn't need to be shouted to be devastating. It just needed the right moment and the right witness. I placed the pendant back down and zipped my bag closed. Whatever happened next wouldn't be an accident. Monday morning arrived heavy and gray, the kind of southern morning that pressed down before the heat fully set in. The will reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and by 9:30 we were already seated in the small conference room at Evan Lindstrom's office downtown. The building was old brick solid, the sort of place that made people lower their voices without being asked. Tessa walked in like she belonged at the head of the table. She wore a tailored navy dress and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. When she smiled at me, it was brief and tight, more a warning than a greeting. She took the chair closest to Evan, crossing her legs, folding her hands neatly in her lap. My mother sat beside her, posture rigid, eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table. She looked relieved, as if this meeting would finally put everything back into its proper order. I chose a seat farther down, my bag at my feet, the folded report tucked inside where no one could see it. Evan entered last, carrying a slim folder and his briefcase. He nodded to each of us, professional and calm, then closed the door behind him. The sound of it clicking shut felt louder than it should have. "Thank you all for coming," he said, taking his seat. "Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this is a formal reading. Questions will be addressed at the appropriate time." Tessa nodded immediately. "Of course," she said. "We all just want to respect Grandpa's wishes." I watched her as she spoke, noting how easily the words came, how natural it sounded when she said his name. Evan began with routine language, outlining dates and documents, his voice steady and measured. I focused on my breathing, on keeping my expression neutral. This was not the moment, not yet. As he moved through the preliminary sections, Tessa relaxed visibly. She leaned back in her chair, glanced once at my mother, then at me, her mouth curving with quiet satisfaction. Whatever she expected to hear, she believed it would confirm what she already knew. Halfway through, Evan paused. "There is an additional document," he said, lifting a sealed envelope from the folder. "A supplemental addendum executed shortly before your grandfather's death." The shift in the room was immediate. Tessa straightened. "I wasn't aware of any addendum," she said too quickly. "I was very involved in his affairs." Evan met her gaze without reacting. "This document was prepared at your grandfather's request and properly filed." My mother's hands tightened together. She looked at me, then searching my face for something: panic, confusion, reassurance. I gave her none. "I will read the primary will first." Evan continued and then addressed the addendum. Tessa exhaled a controlled breath, but the confidence hadn't fully returned to her eyes. She glanced at the envelope again, then away, her jaw setting. I felt the weight of the room settle onto my shoulders. This was the edge of the line I had crossed. There would be no stepping back after this. Whatever came next would unfold in front of witnesses on record, beyond the reach of quiet family explanations. As Evan resumed reading, I caught Tessa watching me out of the corner of her eye. There was something new there now: calculation, assessment. She was adjusting, already preparing to defend whatever she thought might be coming. I kept my gaze on the table, my hands folded, my pulse steady. This wasn't about surprise. It was about sequence. And the sequence had already begun. Evan finished reading the primary will without interruption. When he set the document aside, the room felt tighter, as if the walls had moved in a few inches while no one was looking. Tessa's confidence had returned just enough to look rehearsed. She smoothed her dress, glanced at my mother, and waited. Before I read the addendum, Evan said there is a matter of record related to recent medical events that may be relevant to how it's interpreted. Tessa's head snapped up. Relevant how, she asked. Her tone was controlled but sharp. This is a family matter, Evan. My sister has health issues. Everyone knows that. I do, Evan replied evenly, which is why accuracy matters. He turned toward the back of the room. Mr. Rivas, thank you for waiting. Caleb stood from the chair near the wall. He wasn't dressed like a witness in a courtroom. No uniform, no badge on display. Just a pressed shirt, sleeves buttoned, posture straight. He nodded once respectful, and then spoke. I was one of the paramedics who responded to Riley Maddox's emergency last week, he said. I documented the scene and the condition of the medical alert equipment. Tessa let out a short laugh. You can't seriously be doing this, she said. He's an EMT, not an investigator. Caleb didn't look at her. When we arrived, he continued. The base unit for the medical alert system was unplugged. The pendant was not paired. Those are not symptoms of device failure. Evan raised a hand slightly, a quiet signal to let the statement stand. That's just your interpretation, Tessa shot back. Technology fails all the time. My sister panics. She always has. I felt my mother shift beside her, the familiar instinct to cushion, to soften, to protect the version of events that kept everything livable. Caleb met Evan's eyes. It would take multiple intentional steps to create the conditions we observed. Someone would need access to the unit and the account. That proves nothing, Tessa said quickly. Access doesn't mean intent. The room buzzed with tension now, a low hum under the polished calm. Evan nodded once as if acknowledging a point without conceding it. Thank you, Mr. Rivas, he said. Please remain available. Caleb returned to his seat. The damage, however, had already been done. Tessa turned to me, then finally dropping the performance. You planned this, she said under her breath. You're trying to ambush me. I met her eyes steady. I didn't say anything. That's worse, she snapped. You let him say it for you. Evan cleared his throat. I will now read the addendum. Tessa stood. I object, she said. This is being influenced by speculation and outside interference. If there's going to be an accusation, it should be handled properly, with attorneys present. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. This was the risk I'd known was coming. Delay, disruption, turning process into chaos. Evan closed the folder. We will pause, he said, briefly. My mother reached for my arm, her grip tight. Riley, please, she whispered. You're tearing this family apart. I looked at her hand on my sleeve and felt something steady instead of guilt. Across the room, Tessa was already on her phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. Whatever confidence she had brought in with her was unraveling, replaced by calculation, sharpened into panic. The plan hadn't failed, but it had changed. And as the room emptied for the pause, I understood something with absolute clarity. The truth was out now, not finished, not resolved, but loose. And once something like that is loose, it doesn't go quietly back into its box. The pause stretched longer than I expected. Evan stepped out to make a call, leaving the rest of us in the conference room with our thoughts and the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Tessa stayed near the window phone, pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent. My mother sat frozen at the table, staring at a faint scratch in the wood, as if it might offer instructions. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exposed. I had known there would be resistance, but watching Tessa maneuver in real time, calling someone, recalibrating, made it clear how easily truth could be delayed if it wasn't anchored properly. I had let the first crack show without fully securing what came next. Caleb came to stand near me, keeping his voice low. You okay? I am, I said. Surprised to find that it was true. I just need this done right. He nodded once. Then you'll want this. He handed me a printed page I hadn't seen before. It was a supplemental note from his report, something he'd added after reviewing the alert company's preliminary response. At the bottom was a detail I hadn't fully considered. The account changes weren't just logged to Tessa's device. They were confirmed through a two-step verification sent to her phone number. I read the line twice, then a third time. Access could be shared, passwords could be guessed, but verification required possession, timing, proximity. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was specific. When Evan returned, I asked to speak with him privately. He closed the door again, his expression serious, but open. "She's pushing for delay," he said, threatening to challenge process. I expected that I replied, handing him the page. "But this changes the scope." He read it carefully, his brow furrowing as he reached the bottom. "This ties action to identity," he said, "not just opportunity." "And the addendum?" I asked. "It stands," he said, "but this strengthens how it's interpreted." I took a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Then let's proceed. On record." When we re-entered the room, Tessa ended her call abruptly. She watched Evan with narrowed eyes, searching for advantage. Evan didn't sit. He remained standing, holding the sealed envelope in one hand and the report in the other. Before resuming, he said, "I need to clarify a point raised during the pause." Tessa opened her mouth, already forming an objection. Evan continued, "The medical alert system tied to Riley Maddox's care was not merely accessed. The disabling actions were confirmed via two-step verification linked to a specific phone number." The room went still. My mother's head lifted slowly. She looked at Tessa, really looked at her for the first time all morning. "That doesn't mean," Tessa began, but her voice faltered. She stopped, recalculated, then tried again. "That could have been anyone with my phone." Evan's reply was calm. "That is a matter for investigation, not speculation." He broke the seal. The addendum was read aloud, its language precise and unmistakable. "Any beneficiary found to have interfered with medical care or intentionally impeded emergency response would be excluded from inheritance pending legal review." I didn't look at Tessa while he read. I focused on the table, on the sound of Evan's voice filling the room, steady and unyielding. This wasn't justice yet. It was the mechanism turning on. As Evan finished, he closed the folder. "Given the circumstances," he said, "distribution will be temporarily suspended. Relevant authorities will be notified. Counsel is advised." Tessa sank back into her chair, the fight draining out of her face, replaced by something sharper and more dangerous than anger. Fear. I gathered my bag slowly, deliberately. The pendant was inside, quiet against the fabric. I touched it once, grounding myself in the weight of what had changed. The system had started to move. And this time, it wasn't moving around me. It was moving through the truth. By the time we left Evan's office, the sky had cleared, bright and indifferent. Charleston carried on the way. It always did, cars moving through intersections, people walking into coffee shops. Life continuing as if a family hadn't just cracked open in a conference room. I drove back to the house alone. My mother and Tessa followed in the other car, the silence between us now too heavy to pretend. When we pulled into the driveway, Tessa didn't even look at me. She went straight inside, heels striking the hardwood like punctuation. Within an hour, the phone calls began. Evan called first. His voice was calm, procedural. "I've made the appropriate notifications," he said. "Given the potential interference with medical care, I've advised that a formal inquiry is necessary. Distribution remains suspended until counsel and investigators advise next steps." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't personal. It was a system doing what it was built to do once the right paperwork landed in the right hands. Later that afternoon, a woman introduced herself on the phone as Detective Lila Morris with the Charleston Police Department. Her tone was firm but not unkind. She asked for a statement about the emergency, the medical alert, and the events leading up to it. She asked what I remembered, what I saw, what was said. I told the truth in a plain voice. The pendant didn't work. The base unit was unplugged. Tessa blocked the phone. My mother called it stress. Caleb documented the equipment. The alert company confirmed the two-step verification. When I finished, Detective Morris didn't offer comfort. She offered clarity. Interference with emergency medical response is taken seriously, she said. And if there's evidence of intentional tampering, it won't stay in the realm of family dispute. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the pendant lying beside my mug. For years, I'd been trained to believe the worst consequence that could happen in this house was hurt feelings. Now I understood how wrong that was. Upstairs, Tessa was pacing. I could hear it, the same hallway I'd nearly collapsed in days earlier. The confident footsteps were gone. In their place was something frantic, uneven. She was making calls too, trying to build a wall out of contacts and excuses. By evening, she came downstairs with her phone in her hand, face tight. They can't prove anything, she said more to the air than to me. Access doesn't mean I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My mother stood near the sink. Hands wet dish towel clutched like a shield. She looked older than she had a week ago. Riley, she said softly. This is getting out of hand. I turned toward her. It was out of hand when I couldn't breathe and nobody moved. Her eyes filled, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. The facts didn't leave room for her usual soft explanations. The next day, the consequences tightened again. The alert company emailed confirmation that they were releasing full account logs to authorized parties. Evan forwarded it to me and copied the detective. Caleb's report number was included. Everything linked together cleanly like a chain that could no longer be broken into miscommunication. Tessa's name was now attached to actions with timestamps. Not rumors, not impressions, records. And in a small town where reputations were currency, the first real loss wasn't money, it was certainty. That night I packed quietly, not to run, to prepare, because I could feel the house shifting around me, and I knew the next phase wouldn't be fought with raised voices. It would be fought with documents, interviews, and consequences that no one could charm away. The pendant went into my bag last, not as protection, as proof. The decision came on a Thursday morning, delivered without ceremony. Evan called just after 10, his voice steady, the way it always was when something had finally moved from uncertainty into record. The addendum stood. The suspension was lifted. I was named the sole beneficiary, pending final administrative steps, and a trust would be established to manage the estate, exactly as my grandfather had outlined. Tessa was formally excluded due to documented interference with medical care, and the investigation findings had been forwarded to the appropriate offices. There would be no more delays built on confusion or noise. Justice, it turned out, didn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic exits. It arrived as paperwork, signatures, and doors that closed quietly but permanently. I hung up and sat for a moment, letting the quiet settle. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Later that day, I met with Evan in person to sign the first set of documents. We spoke briefly about logistics, about timelines, about next steps that would take weeks, not days. None of it felt heavy anymore. It felt orderly, contained. When I returned to the house, my mother was waiting at the kitchen table. She looked smaller somehow, folded in on herself, the fight finally gone. I should have protected you, she said. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't even an apology. It was an admission, late but real. I know, I replied. And for the first time, that truth didn't need anything else added to it. I packed the rest of my things that afternoon, not in a rush, not with anger. I left the room as I'd found it, stripped of my presence, no argument left behind. When I reached the front door, my mother stood uncertain, as if waiting for permission. I'm going back to Denver, I said. I need space that's mine. She nodded. She didn't ask me to stay. I drove away before sunset, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was just another shape on a familiar street. I didn't feel like I was leaving something unfinished. I felt like I was finally stepping into something I'd earned. 2 weeks later, back in my own apartment, I replaced my medical alert system. New provider, new account. My name alone on every line. When I pressed the button during the test call, the response came instantly clear and unmistakable. Help was there. That night, I placed the old pendant in a small box, along with copies of the reports and letters that had changed everything, not to dwell on them, to remember what choosing myself had looked like when it mattered. Family, I learned, isn't defined by who shares your last name. It's defined by who doesn't ask you to disappear so they can feel secure. Healing didn't come from winning. It came from walking away with my breath, my truth, and my life intact. I turned off the light knowing that whatever came next would be built on safety, not silence. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Justice Family and choosing healing over harm. You're welcome to share your experience in the comments and follow along if you want to hear more stories like this. Sometimes the next chapter is exactly what someone else needs to feel less alone.